get started again for our next session. And we're getting into the session, Water and Exposure Science. Our first speaker today is Zhou, who will talk about effective prenatal dibutyl phthalate exposure on fetal-placental vascular function. You can say that 5 times fast. So thank you. We'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Frank. And first of all, thank you so much for this great opportunity to present the research in our lab. So I personally is a reproductive physiologist where I focus on the fetal programming of the cardiovascular system. And the talk I'm going to give today is a relatively new line of research happening in my lab where I started recently in UFA, where we focus on the endocrine disruptor exposure during pregnancy, how it affects the fetal placenta vascular development. So first of all, I think for many people in this room probably already know that phthalate is a group of endocrine disruptors that existing almost everywhere. And as a phthalate congener, DPP is actually being utilized in many products in our daily life. And women of reproductive age are actually with tremendous amount of DPP exposure through cosmetics, daily consumable products, medication coating, and occupational exposures. And one thing I want to know that women of color actually have higher exposure than other ethnic groups in terms of DPP exposure. And in terms of bioavailability of DPP, it is actually have very high bioavailability percentage when it's ingested or breathing in by the human body. And the DPP is actually would allow to be entering the underground water system by the landfill. And to date, our regulation of DPP in the United States is relatively loose. Overall, in the entire country, from 2008, it has regulation on the children's toy and consumables of 0.1% by weight, which is about 1 gram per kilogram. And only states in the United States have a relatively stricter regulation is California. However, when it comes to packaging, it does not matter at all. Then you kind of have this loophole to have it introduced to your daily consumable products again. And for medications, the drug that was in the market from 2012 actually is recommended to not include this as medication coating. However, for whatever medication that's on the market in circulation before 2012, it's not binded to this regulation. Then we can think about how many pills are approved before that time. So unfortunately, DPP is known to have adverse impact to cardiovascular and metabolic health of human. And specifically, prenatal exposure, which means when the mother is exposed to DPP during her pregnancy, it has adverse effect on the fetus as well. So it's associated with preterm birth, fetal growth restriction, as well as childhood obesity of the babies who exposed to DPP during pregnancy in the womb. And unfortunately, multiple biomonitoring studies have shown that almost most mothers and babies are actually positive of DPP exposure during pregnancy. And this study was true in United States, in Asia, in Europe. So this is very unfortunately. And for animal studies, it has been shown that the DPP exposure prenatally would actually impair the male reproductive development, reduce the maternal fetal blood flow and nutrient supply. And I want to remark, this was actually done by the zebrafish model. And it is also associated with obesity and metabolic disorder in the mice. So unfortunately, most of these studies has done in a very high concentration in terms of the DPP exposure dosage, and that probably contributed to the relatively high regulation limit because that's as low as the study's data is going for. And so we are specifically interested in the fetal placenta and vascular function is because the cardiovascular system going through dramatic change during pregnancy. The mother's blood volume going through about 20% to 25% increase during the pregnancy. A majority of that blood is actually distributed to the placenta, which is the temporary organ that supports the baby's nutrients during pregnancy and connected with the maternal uterus. So this is an image on the right is showing a placenta and how it's located in the womb. And it is connecting the maternal uterus to the fetus through a structure called umbilical cord, which hosts the two major types of vessels. The umbilical vein, which is the vessel carry all the blood and factors from the maternal and placenta tissue to the fetus, while the umbilical arteries are actually the blood vessels carry all the blood from the fetal circulation back to the placenta and eventually go back to the maternal circulation. So I want to mention this because this is a little bit opposite than the regular circulation system. So dysregulation of placenta vasculature during pregnancy would have really severe implications. When it's dysregulated, it's associated with pregnancy complication like fetal growth restriction, and also it has long-term effect on the cardiovascular health of the fetus. So our lab have previously utilized endothelial cells, which is the monolayer of cells that line the lumen of all blood vessels. We have exposed these cells from primary human umbilical vein artery cells that's exposed to DBP, and we found out that the DBP exposure would actually reduce the cell viability dose-dependently. And for studies performing by others using immortalized human endothelial cell lines, they have found that the DBP exposure also adversely affects the cell migration as well as the nitric oxide production, which is a vasodilation, which means the ability of the blood vessel to dilate is actually getting impaired. So taking together of what we know so far, we know that DBP is known to be adversely affect the male fertility, but we don't know so much about how it affects the female fertility and the pregnancy. And we also know that most studies are actually doing in a much lower concentration than the actual human involvement. So we hypothesize that human involvement relevant low dosage of DBP exposure would also affect the fetal placenta vascular function. So to test our hypothesis with mice model with or without oral ingestion of a very low amount, if you notice the number, it's the lowest range of the spectrum of human exposure. We expose them for 30 days before pregnancy and throughout the pregnancy for 18.5 days. We measure the daily weight as well as body fat composition of the mothers as well as the umbilical blood flow by the late pregnancy. We also examine the lipid accumulation of the placenta. And just to show the data of our weight measurement, we found out that this low amount does not change the maternal weight before pregnancy. However, it significantly delays the weight gain in early pregnancy, which is critical for the placenta development. And interestingly, by the end of pregnancy, the DBP-exposed animal actually have higher weight gain, which they actually indicative of the, which is critical moment for the fetal development. And we actually examine the maternal body composition as well as major organs in the mother, and we did not find any differences between them. So we figured we should look at the fetal side, and interestingly, we found out that even though the fetal weight did not change, we actually noticed significantly higher placenta weight in DBP-exposed animals, which indicative of a lower placenta efficiency, which means to support the same weight of fetus, we needed a much bigger placenta. And then to examine the blood flow going forward to the placenta, we have using this non-invasive high-frequency ultrasound, and in this system, we managed to examine several parameters: the PSV, which indicative vasodilation, the EDV, indicative of vasoconstriction, pulsatility means how many pulses of the blood flow per second, as well as the resistance index, it's indicative of the resistance of the blood vessel. So our data have found out that we have significantly increased in the fetal umbilical vein EDV, which indicative of a weaker vasoconstriction of the blood from the placenta to the fetus that may contribute to the lower placenta efficiency we have noticed. And we also found out that the fetal side of placenta have fetal sex-specific reduction of lipid disposition in the female fetus, while in the maternal side, there's no difference. Okay, to sum up everything we have so far, we have found out even with this super low concentration of DBP exposure, we still observe adverse impact of the placenta efficiency as well as vascular function. And the fetal sex-specific reduced placenta lipid disposition as well. So taking together, we believe there are more studies at a relatively lower or relevant concentration of human pollution is important. And that's all for my presentation. I hope I'm right on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for questions.
Do you have any thoughts about the sex difference and the action of this on that? What's going on there? Do you have any thoughts on what's happening?
That's a very interesting question, and we are very intrigued by the fact that the female fetus actually have less lipid in their fetal placenta. So there are a couple of theories we're planning to test in the future. So in general, fat disposition is very critical for female reproductive ability and fertility development. And based on even though at that early stage, there's still female hormones or X chromosome bounded genes are expressed more in the fetal side. So we believe that could potentially contribute to the fact that there's less in there. There are two scenarios. Either it's harder to get through due to the fetal development, or that the female fetus use it up. So in the future, we are having plan to trying to figure out what's happening in that area. And we do find it very interesting that only female fetus has a off lipid disposition.
Great, thank you very much.